Good evening, folks. Welcome to our New York City Mayoral Forum on Closing Rikers. My name is Tracy Gardner, and I'm the Vice President of Policy Advocacy for Legal Action Center. I am proud to partner with our allied co-sponsors for tonight's event. In 2016, survivors of Rikers Island launched a campaign to permanently close the 9 jails on Rikers Island and the boat, which built on a growing movement to respect and protect Black lives and invest in communities most impacted by state violence. My organization, the Legal Action Center, has contributed to this bold vision through our work to elevate alternatives to incarceration and reentry programs, along with the New York City ATI and Reentry Coalition. While New York has the most robust array of these programs in the country, they are a pittance compared to what we could invest in them and our communities to make Rikers Island irrelevant. After decades of advocacy, New York City is closer than ever to closing Rikers Island due to the courage and commitment of formerly incarcerated leaders. We've made important progress, but Rikers Island is not yet closed. And it continues to violate the human rights of New Yorkers as long as it's open. Today's news announcing the resignation of the DOCS commissioner illustrates that it's not possible to oversee a fundamentally and irredeemably broken system. And while we are aiming for it, abolition is not happening next year. My colleague said that in the news today. Anyone running for elected office in 2021 must be committed to erasing this stain on New York City and must be accountable to directly impacted people. During our program, you will hear from some of the key leaders behind the advocacy to demolish New York City's existing 14 jails while permanently reducing citywide jail capacity over 75%. We will also air, for the first time, one-on-one interviews between mayoral candidates and formerly incarcerated New Yorkers and advocates who've anchored the movement to close Rikers. Please note that the event is being live streamed on YouTube and Facebook, and we want to acknowledge our allies in co-sponsoring this event: Freedom Agenda, Women's Community Justice Association, Exodus Transitional Community, Vera Action, BronxConnect, and the New York City's Jails Action Coalition. Thank you especially to Trinity Church Wall Street for investing in the leadership of communities most harmed by Rikers Island. And a special thanks to Now This News, who are helping us broadcast to their 17 million subscriber base because they recognize the immense value of centering impacted voices in this work. So we are going to begin with a landscape overview to ground us in the conversation tonight. Julian Harris Calvin from the Vera Institute for Justice will lead us through it.
Thank you, Tracy. So as Tracy mentioned, my name is Julian Harris Calvin, and I am participating today on behalf of Vera Action, the advocacy arm of the Vera Institute of Justice. So let's dive right into Rikers Island and learning about the state of New York City's jail. I'll ask Charlie just to bump up the PowerPoint presentation and we can begin. So Rikers Island is a jail complex, slide 2, built on land owned by a notorious judge who used his position to perpetuate the slave trade, and it has for almost a century been a stain on this city. Slide 2, please. While the number of people held on the island has fluctuated from a high of more than 20,000 in the early 1990s to below 4,000 just last year, it has always been a warehouse of human suffering and misery, as Tracy just mentioned. But as she mentioned, in a historic 2019 vote, New York City pledged to close Rikers Island and to replace 4 decrepit, decaying facilities that currently exist in 4 of the boroughs, and to cap the citywide jail population at 3,300 New Yorkers by 2026, a date that has already been pushed back to 2027. Next slide, please. The decision to shrink the city's jail population and permanently shutter the island's facilities reflects a decades-long trend in declining crime, arrest, and jail incarceration rates. From August 2016 to January 2020, the New York City jail population declined by nearly 75%, allowing the city to empty all of the jails in the boroughs except for the 800-bed Vernon C. Bain Correction Center, known as the Boat, which floats on a barge docked at Hunts Point. And of course, also the remaining 6 active jails within the Rikers jail complex. This decline also reduced jail capacity to below 60% at all but 3 of those jails in 2019. Slide 4, please. So the passage of sweeping statewide bail reform in 2019 expedited the decarceration necessary to get us closer to that 3,300 person cap needed to realize the Rikers closure plan. What you can see here is that even though the new bail reform laws didn't go into effect until January of last year, the city's jail population declined by a whopping 29% between passage of bail reform in 2019 and February of 2020, just after the new law went into effect. Then we'll see here in the slide a continued dip in the jail population, hitting a low of 3,859 in May of 2020, which indicates that judges very quickly acted to implement bail reform even before its effective date. And in fact, most of the city's jail decarceration happened before COVID-19 arrived. But once the pandemic hit, judges continued to limit the use of bail, helping more people to remain at home during the pendency of their cases, even though trials were put on hold and some other court proceedings shut down in response to the threat of the pandemic. But then you'll see here, in midsummer, we see judges beginning to revert back to their old practices as the jail population ticks back up, despite the continued ravages of the pandemic. And that has slowly continued into this year. Next slide. Here we see, in the second half of 2020, the incarceration of New Yorkers who were awaiting trial increased. These pretrial admissions had dropped by 58% between January and April of 2020. But they then increased by 40% between April of last year and July. And in early 2021, and we're just beginning the year, admission of people awaiting trial while held in our jails was only slightly lower than during the same time period last year. Next slide. So recent data analysis from our friends at the Center for Court Innovation illustrates that judges have increased their use of bail. Bail that is holding more New Yorkers in jail as they await trial. Notably, the percentage of cases in which judges set bail increased substantially for both nonviolent felonies as well as violent felonies. For nonviolent felonies, judges set bail in about 10% of cases in the first half of 2020. But in the second half of the year, judges' use of bail increased to around 20%. And for violent felonies, the percentage of cases in which judges set bail increased from around 40% to north of 50%. And these are numbers that are very similar to how judges used bail before the passage of bail reform. So this has led to a substantial increase in our jail population since last summer. Next slide. So from July 2020 to March 2021, the number of people in New York City jails increased by more than 1,500 people, which is a 41% increase. Our jail population is now at 5,646 New Yorkers, higher than it was in January of last year. And that's even though, on the whole, crime rates in our city continue to be on par with the historic lows of 2019. Next slide. Here we see the trends in major felony offenses. So the total number of major felonies in 2020 and 2019 were the same. And in fact, the annual number of major felony offenses has hardly changed during the past 4 years. To date, major felony offenses are down 7% in 2021 compared to the same time period in 2020. Although it is true that there has been an increase in murders and shootings, but it is very important to put that into context. Next slide. The number of murders remains at historic lows. Of course, we don't have numbers for the full 2021 calendar year, but looking at the number of murders in 2020, the data show that murders are 30% fewer than in the year 2000, 76% fewer than in 1993, and 79% fewer than in 1990. But New York City continues to invest billions of dollars in the Department of Correction, despite decades of declining crime and incarceration rates, and despite the city's current plan to cap our jail population at 3,300 people. Next slide. Since 2011, New York City's jail population has decreased 58%, yet the Department of Correction budget has decreased by only 1% in that same time. And now we see that the mayor's budget for the next fiscal year includes a 6% increase in Department of Correction spending, reaching a whopping $2.63 billion. This enormous correction budget is an outlier when you juxtapose it with other large US cities with large jail systems like the city of Los Angeles. Next slide. So it costs $438,000 to incarcerate a single person for a year in New York City jails, whereas the national average is $47,000 per person per year. So it's $438,000 in New York, and the rest of the country on average is $47,000. This huge cost is largely driven by personnel expenses. New York City's correction officer to incarcerated person ratio is also a national outlier, and it has been that way for a very long time. In 2020, our incarcerated person to correction officer ratio was 3 New Yorkers for every 5 correction officers. In 2012, it was 7 incarcerated people for every 5 officers. Comparatively, the national average is 21 incarcerated people for every 5 officers. 86% of last year's correction budget went to staffing our increasingly vacant jails. Jails that the city has pledged to continue to decarcerate during historic low crime rates. These are dollars that could be better spent on decarceration and closure efforts, and on reinvesting in community supports for New Yorkers who are most affected by violence, criminalization, and mass incarceration, as well as the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic, which struck Black and Brown communities in the city hardest. And with that, I will pass it back to my colleague, Tracy, to continue the forum.
Thank you, Julian. So those are the sobering statistics. That's just the facts. And so this is absolutely an issue that whoever is the next mayor must take on. And they don't have to make it up or start from scratch. If you listen to people who've experienced Rikers and what needs to happen for the communities most impacted by incarceration, you will make the right decisions. I would now like to introduce the tireless Brandon Holmes, co-director of Freedom Agenda, who will be moderating for the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Tracy. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I wanted to first frame some of the conversation that we're about to get into and some of the work that has gone into pulling this event together. So we will hear from panelists who include some of the advocates and experts who are survivors of Rikers or service providers who have serviced New Yorkers for decades and have worked both behind jail cells, in jails with people, and on the other side of the wall out in our communities. The reason that our panel is comprised mostly of survivors of Rikers and service providers is because in this current digital age, many candidates have decided that they can no longer participate in virtual forums or events that were scheduled after a specific date or time where their campaigns calendars were more flexible. So in order to include and engage candidates in this event, we sent a questionnaire that compiled a list of questions that I'll get into in a little bit. And we also were able to schedule some one-to-one interviews between survivors of Rikers and some of the candidates for the New York City mayor's race. First, I want to introduce our panel before we share some of the results of those questionnaires and air those videos for you. So starting out with Darren Mack, my co-director at Freedom Agenda. We will hear from each of the panelists what their connection to the movement to close Rikers is and how they've been involved. So Darren, can you tell folks a little bit about your experience with Rikers Island and how you've taken a leadership role in ensuring the permanent closure of the jails?
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. So I'm a survivor of Rikers, co-director of Freedom Agenda, and I've been engaged in the movement to close Rikers since 2016, when there was an unusual amount of people in certain communities in New York City didn't know much about Rikers Island, except for communities like the South Bronx, Harlem, Bronzeville, East New York, which have been historically under-resourced, over-policed, and directly impacted by the carceral system. So these communities knew Rikers all too well, and there was no attention to what was happening to incarcerated people in Rikers Island like it is now, So it was out of sight, out of mind, but thanks to, advocates, survivors of the Rikers, and of allies, we kept moving forward, raising them, putting the spotlight where the spotlight hasn't been enough to raise awareness to what was happening inside what I call the last penal colony in the United States.
Thank you, Darren. And next, I want to introduce Kendra Clark, who works at Exodus Transitional Community, one of the reentry and housing providers that has serviced New Yorkers for years, and has a huge reputation for being one of the first places that people come to when they return home to our communities. Kendra, can you share a little bit about your experience with Rikers Island and how you've led on this campaign?
Sure. Thank you, Brandon, and welcome everyone. I spent 4 months on Rikers Island before being sent to an upstate prison and experienced a lot of harass, trauma, the same abuse that a lot of women experience before incarceration. We often experience during incarceration as well. And, working with Exodus, we are an organization that is led by directly impacted people. Our founder and executive director is directly impacted. And we have about 180 staff, and about 85% of our staff are directly impacted by incarceration as well. So everyone who walks through our door has experienced the same abuse and trauma, and we want to see the system changed. So, we are dedicated as an organization, as human beings, to making change and making the world a better place.
Yeah, I think you're on mute, Brandon.
Thank you. Next, I want to call up Sharon White Harrigan, who works with the Women's Community Justice Association and anchors a lot of the work around the Beyond Rosies campaign. Sharon, please share with us your experience and how you've worked on these campaigns.
Well, thank you, Brandon, and welcome everybody. My name is Sharon White Harrigan, and I am the executive director of the Women's Community Justice Association, and I am also a survivor of the violent and most brutal places that a person can be, of Rikers Island. And so, WCJA is an organization that is gender focused, and we are women and gender nonconforming, that is about elevating the voices of the women. We are creating platforms for women to come to the forefront, because as we know that women are underrepresented on the outside, but overrepresented inside the jails and the prison walls. So it's just important that within this work, I came to it on a personal level, but also to say, what about the women? What about her? And so that's what, we're about, is to say, yes, close Rikers, but in the interim of that, what about the women? Let's pull them off.
Thank you, Sharon. Next, we'll go to Reverend Wendy Calderon Payne, who has been a longtime service provider throughout New York and represents BronxConnect. Reverend Wendy, please share with us some of the work and the legacy that you've left in New York City and continue to have.
Hey, BronxConnect really began as a vision in 1999 on how to address the epidemic of youth incarceration in our community. We were a group of small local South Bronx churches, and this was our community. And at that time, I think it was like 23,000 people a day were being incarcerated in Rikers and in the barge. And we have grown to do reentry. We do a lot of employment. We basically do whatever our community needs. So this is kind of like, we think, well, what if the whole focus of BronxConnect is if it was your child, your niece, your nephew caught up in this terrible system that seeks to destroy them, how far would you go? Would you pick up the phone call at 12 o'clock at night? Would you, make bail? What would you do? How far would you go? And that's really how we believe that love really goes far. And I'm going to say this. So, why are we involved in this? This Rikers is a waste of money, and it's also a waste of human potential. And Rikers destroys people's hearts. And if you look at the Khalif Browder documentary, he actually told his mother that he said that he could like hear voices. He had demons when he left Rikers. And I think, it's almost like it's an evil that seeks to destroy people, men and women. And so anyone with any kind of moral standing should say this is a waste of money. This is a waste of capital. And I'm going to even say this, even for the Department of Corrections, I don't think people can leave Rikers without being scarred. Beside the fact that there's all this concern about toxic fumes and toxic this, I think there's when you treat other human beings in a subhuman way, it affects you. And so I've even known correction officers who've retired who've said this was bad for me. So I think we need to close Rikers. I mean, we just need to push forward and close Rikers, because abolition is coming, but it's not coming this year, as our good friend Sister V said.
Thank you. And lastly, want to bring up Minister Dr. Victoria Phillips, who has long been an advocate both inside the jails and outside the jails. And Ms. V, can you please tell us about your history providing support and care for people on both sides of the walls?
Thank you so much, Brandon. Peace and blessings, everyone. Can you hear me? Very good. My connection to Rikers Island started many years ago. I first entered onto the island working as a nurse, doing nursing through agency. And I returned back to the island years later to do cognitive behavioral therapy. And most recently, I sometimes do monitoring for those with mental health concerns. And so it's very important for me to say that, because I've seen different things throughout the island in different positions. And I've had unlimited access in one of those positions, which afforded me to build rapport and to see the injustice being done. And so as an Army brat, I realized, oh my goodness, so many people are having their violations of human rights. So many people are not afforded their constitutional rights while behind the walls. And the most important thing that made me speak out and join the Jails Action Coalition in 2012 is because no one really believes they're formerly incarcerated when they come out to speak their truth. And so it was extremely important for me as a service provider to stand with the people who are bold enough to speak their truth and make sure that changes occur. So I don't want to talk too much, but now I work at the Mental Health Project Urban Justice Center, and I just love what we do, because my entire fight is for the people, especially those who have invisible disabilities, and those who cannot properly advocate or speak up for themselves. And so this is a long-standing fight. We have much work to do, but I'm going to stay connected because I'm a true New Yorker, and this is what I do.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate all of your efforts to get us to this point and being on this call tonight. Before we go into some of the candidates' responses and some of those videos that we want to share with folks, I want to ask folks, we can go back to Darren. Darren, what do you think, what would you say are the things you're seeing missing from the conversation around the mayoral race and, you know, all the things that have been covered under the sun, all the conversations and commitments that candidates have made? What would you say is something that's really missing around Rikers Island?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there's a number of things. You know, Rikers Island, like I mentioned, is the last penal colony in the United States. It's basically perhaps one of the biggest criminal justice issues in the country. You know, and I think some of the questions that's missing from the candidates race is like the lack of conversations with not only the people who've been advocating and bringing and who brought us to this point where we are right now, but those communities. You know, those communities that I mentioned that have been historically under-resourced. You know, Bronzeville, South Bronx, Harlem. Just hearing those names of those communities, people have a vision or an idea of what I mean when I say historically under-resourced. So being in those communities that's impacted by this carceral system and talking to the people to figure out what do we need, not just to survive, but to thrive. So and sitting down at the table, you know, to really push this thing forward, because I believe that we could decarcerate faster if we all get on board. I believe that we could eventually achieve a New York City that can invest in the things that a lot of communities have been getting for decades, but other communities have been neglected. And that's why we have to speak out and also have conversations with these candidates. So questions like that come to my mind and thoughts like that, yeah.
Thank you. I want to go back to Reverend Wendy and ask you the same question. What do you think what's the most alarming thing you've seen missing from the conversation around our next mayor?
Sorry about that. I think there has to be a certain amount of accountability for the Department of Corrections. Like, I think, you know, that I've always said this, when you see some of the assaults and I understand like there are difficult situations, but we need to teach people how to de-escalate difficult situations, you know, and there are things that happen within Rikers, as told to me by people who've been there, my staff, that is so inhumane that if I had done that to my child, I would lose custody of my child. Or if, God forbid, my agency had done this to a young person, I would lose all my contracts. Like they might even arrest me. So I don't understand, like there needs to be an accountability to a system. Like I understand there's strength in unions, and, you know, my mom was part of a union, but a union needs to hold itself accountable. And this whole thing about a significant portion of the staff is out sick. You know, I would like to know why. You know, I'd like to know who has held the union accountable. And I'm not sure if any candidate is asking those kind of questions, you know, but that's my question, because I know that my staff couldn't be out that many days. If I had a third of my staff out and I went to the city and said, well, I need more money because my staff are out, they would laugh at me. You know, they would laugh at me. They would say unacceptable, not acceptable at all. So those are the questions that, and I would love to see which candidate is going to do something like that.
And I want to check in with Miss V before we move to the next section. Ms. V, you, through the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project and through Jails Action Coalition, and also our allies at the Halt Solitary campaign, you've been fighting to eliminate solitary confinement in New York City. And also, I've seen you every month go up to bat in Board of Corrections hearings, talking about the need for transforming programming and conditions and just responses to violence. Can you kind of build off of what Reverend Wendy was saying around DOC accountability? What are you looking for from the next mayor?
Absolutely, Brandon. So one thing I didn't mention is that I've sat on the advisory board for the Department of Corrections, Adolescents, and Young Adults for 6.5 years. And so I know for a fact that we don't have time to spend time trying to reinvent the wheel. What we do need to make sure is that those who are directly impacted are at the table to push the right thing agendas forward. And so Reverend Wendy was correct when she says staff report barbaric things to her. I've directly seen those things. And what's really important is accountability. That's my favorite word when I'm in front of city council or the Board of Corrections, because there is none. And what's interesting is that the first 10 federal monitors reports actually highlight that and show the lack of leadership, the lack of accountability from the top on down. And it's clear if you tune into a Board of Correction hearing or even a city council hearing in New York City, that the Department of Correction, they're allowed to just do whatever they want. They don't have to properly respond when things are supposed to be submitted in a timely fashion. When it comes to life, it's taken as a joke. That's one of the things that fueled me, even though I used to get threats, to keep speaking out on the record, because a human life is worth nothing behind the wall. Many people see the brutality that goes on with police because it's captured on camera, but the brutality that goes on behind the walls, I've had nightmares. I'll put it to you like this. After my emergency brain surgery, I literally woke up, and even though I could barely remember memories of my son, I remembered the things that were embedded in my brain from things I've observed behind the walls. That's how horrific those things are. And that's how necessary it is for the next mayor to step in, ready, willing, and able to take charge, rearrange everything, and hold people accountable. And it's our job as the community to make sure that they do that. It's our job to make sure the mayor does it, city council does it, and the Board of Correction does it. And that's how we have to educate and organize. Thank you for putting this on tonight.
Thank you, Ms. V. And I've got plenty of follow-ups for some other folks, but I want to start getting into some of the ways that we've engaged candidates and some of the responses that we've gotten, which will be available and distributed to everybody in attendance after the event. So to first start out, we want to just clarify with folks that this is a C3 event and a C3 group that we have formed. We are not going to be endorsing any candidates, and we do not want you to watch this forum and think that anything we are sharing with you should influence your decision. This is simply for public education purposes, and we are not looking to compare candidates' responses or compare candidates' views against our own, but rather provide context and background information on the history of this movement to close Rikers and these leaders who are here ready to respond to questions or concerns that people may have and continue to elevate those before the primary, after the primary, and well into the transition for the next mayoral administration. We did invite all candidates to participate in this live event, and due to scheduling conflicts or just packed calendars, we did get mixed engagement. So for the 2 interviews that we will be able to share some footage from later this evening, we were able to speak with Andrew Yang and Diane Morales. Those 2 candidates did not respond in writing to our questionnaire, but they did commit to participating in those one-to-one interviews with Darren and Kendra. For candidates who did complete our questionnaire, which we will be able to disseminate the information they shared in writing, we have Maya Wiley, Shaun Donovan, and Scott Stringer's responses. I'll get into a little bit of those in a second, but also want to provide some background on the candidates who had declined to participate. So those who had declined to participate were Catherine Garcia, Eric Adams, and Ray McGuire. And we do want to mention that we were in communication with Catherine Garcia's team, who said that it was just not possible to record something ahead of this time. But we were able to move forward with the Andrew Yang and Diane Morales interviews, as I mentioned, and we will be looking to continue engaging candidates on these issues because we believe that this is something that has been a #1 criminal justice priority for this administration, even if the de Blasio administration was dragged into making a commitment and dragged into passing a plan that could move our city forward. We know that this is going to have to be a top priority for an incoming administration. So we are dedicated and committed to continuing that work. To share some of the background on how we developed these questions on our questionnaire, we will be sharing in a follow-up email to all people who registered and attended this event the PDF responses from the Wiley, Stringer, and Donovan campaigns. The questions that we asked were very specific questions because we know that we cannot afford to be vague around Rikers Island, and we can't boil it down to just vague talking points or vague commitments to decarcerate or explore options to change the bail system, which the mayoral administration does not have control over. So we needed to be very specific in our questions to candidates. The opening question, which each of these candidates supported with varying positions on that, was, do you support closing Rikers Island by or before August 31st, 2027, and reducing total citywide jail capacity to 3,300 or less by that time? Each candidate had their own responses to this, but ultimately said, yes, I do commit to closing Rikers Island and reducing citywide jail capacity to 3,300 or less. Then we moved into asking if they supported moving forward with the Renewable Rikers Plan, and if so, how they would actually ensure the transfer of land from custody of Department of Corrections to the Department of Citywide Administrative Services as quickly as possible. The reason that we believe this question was so important is because as long as Rikers Island stands, and as long as there is capacity to incarcerate over 15,000 New Yorkers, we know that the systems that exist will continue to try to invest or use capacity and incarcerate our neighbors and loved ones as much as they can. So it is very important for us to hold the city accountable to not only closing Rikers, but permanently transforming the face of the island and the use of the island. The next question we asked was how they would address the dangerous and dehumanizing conditions on Rikers Island and in existing borough jails. At this point today, the Brooklyn House of Detention in downtown Brooklyn and the Manhattan Tombs in Lower Manhattan have been emptied in effort to close Rikers Island. These facilities were also just as decrepit and deteriorating as facilities on Rikers, and we know that they are unacceptable in any condition. Next, we asked about their efforts in decarcerating New York City. We know that last year, Rikers Island held roughly 3,800 individuals thanks to citywide efforts to rapidly decarcerate in response to COVID. But this year, we saw in January 2021 that the population had risen over 5,400 individuals in custody. So we need to know how the next mayor of New York City will reduce the average daily jail population during their first year in office to actualize the decarceration that is required to achieve this plan. We asked many questions around the number of women and transgender nonconforming folks who are currently on Rikers in the only women and transgender nonconforming facility, the Rose M. Singer Center, which is physically on Rikers, and if they could actually commit to releasing all of those folks and getting them off of Rikers before 2027? I won't continue with the rest of the questionnaire because we will share all of that information with folks, but we wanted to give you an idea of how we were trying to dig deeper past what we've heard in passing or seen on social media from candidates, how we were digging deeper to get clear commitments and clear visions on how we move forward with closing Rikers Island. So now I want to talk a little bit before we share the interview between Darren and Andrew Yang. I want to chat with Darren, and if we can get Darren back on the screen, and ask Darren, so what is, for you as someone who has worked on this campaign, what is maybe your largest concern, your biggest priority for a next mayoral administration coming in January 2022? What do you think is your number one priority? What is the number one thing you believe that candidate needs to focus on?
Yeah, that's a really hard question, but I would say because some things are interconnected and it has to happen like simultaneously. So decarceration is probably like the top issue, and that's also tied to like not only the incarcerated population that's currently incarcerated, but also into re-entry services and alternatives to incarceration, but also like excarceration, like prevented people from getting into the criminal legal system in the first place. And in order to address that, like I always say, in order to end mass incarceration, we have to have mass investments. The same in these communities that's been impacted, that's been historically under-resourced and hyper-criminalized. So yeah, in a nutshell, briefly, those are probably like the two things that have to happen simultaneously.
Thanks, Darren. So we're going to share that video interview with Darren and Andrew. And I also want to just thank really quickly Sarita from Freedom Agenda, who is in the chat right now, providing some links and background information. So if you're interested in learning more about these issues, please check out those links. And she's also responding to some quick questions in the chat. We will be taking more questions towards the end of the program, but just wanted to shout her out. And Charlie, whenever you're ready, we can roll the Andrew Yang video.
Support closing Rikers Island and the boat by or before August 31st, 2027, and reducing total citywide jail capacity to 3,300 or less by that time.
I support closing Rikers Island as soon as we can. It's a stain on the city. It's inhumane. It's incredibly costly. It's inefficient. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. We have to close it as soon as possible. And we have to do everything we can to see to it that not a single person that should not be in our jailing system is there, which would reduce the number. It's tough for me to commit to when we can get this done by, but we need to get it done. We need to get it done as quickly as possible. And I'm committed to doing just that.
So how will you address dangerous and dehumanizing conditions on Rikers Island and in existing borough jails?
Well, first there's Rikers, and the conditions in Rikers are deplorable. So the way to improve it is by trying to close Rikers as quickly as possible and get people out. No, so that has the mission goal. Not real. The city council is now investing in Rikers for a different purpose, which makes perfect sense to me. And then when any new jail is built in the boroughs, we have to make it a dramatic leap forward in terms of the conditions, the environment, the cultures, the treatment. I mean, the goal should be to have jails that reflect our values, and Rikers does not do that. Hopefully the new jail will better represent what New York is about, where our people are concerned.
you said before that you believe the current plan to demolish the jails did not have a lot of community engagement. I was there when the Lippman Commission began taking public comments from all 5 boroughs in 2016 and 2017. And the URLA process, which certified the current plan, also had public hearings from the community boards, borough president, council. So what do you mean when you say there was not enough community engagement, and what would you change about that process?
It did go through a very arduous process. There were a lot of people who had every opportunity to make their voices heard. My experience with it has frankly been well after that process, where when I walk around to communities now, essentially, or like the last number of weeks, people will say, hey, we have this issue with this location or the height or the nature of the structure. And so you're correct that there was a very thorough process, and I appreciate everyone who helped drive that forward. A lot of incredible activists like yourself, Darren, made it happen. And now we have to have a plan that will work for both the needs of those who are living in various communities, as well as the city, in terms of a vision of, again, jails that reflect our values in the boroughs, where they'd be more accessible to families, to attorneys, to people that ought to be able to access those who are in jail, however briefly.
Do you support moving forward with the Renewable Rikers Plan?
Yes, I love the Renewable Rikers Plan. What a way to reverse the usage of an environment. Right now, again, it's this stain on the city in many respects. And so if it can become a bastion of a renewable economy, that would be tremendous. And I love the vision for it.
As of January 2021, the population has risen above 5,400 people in custody. How will you, as mayor of New York City, reduce the average daily jail population during your first year in office?
Well, the first thing we need to do is decriminalize things that aren't really hurting people or the public interest so much. So I'm committed to decriminalizing sex crime as one example. I've committed to decriminalizing possession of opiates for personal use, not to sell or traffic or to profit from. We have to focus on the things that actually genuinely concern our own public safety. And so if we do this right, then there'd be fewer people being thrown in jail for certain types of crimes and offenses. We need to invest in our mental health resources, because a lot of the people who are in jail right now actually shouldn't be in jail. They should be in a mental health facility getting the kind of therapy or medication that they need. So we need to dramatically increase the number of psych beds and resources. I've committed to increasing psych beds by 20%. I actually think we should go higher than that. But the psych bed supply has been going the wrong direction for a number of years now. And the third thing is I've committed to a comprehensive anti-poverty plan that I think will help keep people in more stable situations and away from environments that would run afoul of the law. And so if we invest in people and families and communities directly, we can hopefully reduce the population that's interacting with our criminal justice system over time.
Okay. Follow-up question. So have you done any projections on how low you believe the jail population can be?
Well, if the estimates are correct around the proportion that belong in mental health facilities, then it would significantly impact the number of people that are heading into the jailing system. But I don't have a hard number as to what we think that would be.
That would be something, because right now the plan is for a max of 3,300 in the borough-based plan. So I'm just wondering if some of the things that you implement will have a much more reduction in this population side. But probably go get back with your campaign with that. How will your administration continue to significantly reduce the number of women in detention?
Well, first, they shouldn't be on Rikers. I mean, that's one problem. Like if it was in another facility that was in one of the boroughs, it would be less of an issue. And we should be certain treating those who might have distinct needs if they were transgender in like a specific environment. I mean, that's something that should never be taking place on Rikers. That's for sure. Hopefully the measures that we have in place to reduce the jail population generally around mental health and anti-poverty and decriminalizing sex work in particular would reduce the number of women and transgender people that are in the jailing system. I think decriminalizing sex work in particular would have a big impact there.
Interesting. A related question to that. So are you committed to closing the Rose M. Singer Center, which is the only women's jail in New York City, before 2027?
Well, again, we need to close Rikers as soon as possible. It seems like there's an opportunity there to close the women's jail even sooner because you're talking about a population in the low hundreds. And so if you had any facility that was appropriate in the boroughs, then that could be the first change you make. And that would be tremendous. I would love to do that first.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that interview, Darren. I appreciate that. I want to get Kendra back on with me because we saw that Darren had asked Andrew Yang about his comments on the lack of community engagement. And I know that everyone on this panel had participated in the Littman Commission and the Euler process, but Kendra, you are not only a survivor of Rikers Island, but you live in the community where the future and currently closed Queens facility is located. Can you give people who are viewing some more background on how the commission and Euler process informed the vote to close Rikers?
Absolutely. I think I'll start by saying the Euler process was absolutely exhausting because of so many meetings, hearings, public comments. I mean, it felt like 3 days a week we were doing something around a meeting or a hearing. So it was very, very extensive. And we utilized a lot of the commission's reports and research to inform and educate the community during the Euler process. So in Kew Gardens, for example, we had our regular community board meetings, and we also formed the Queens Neighborhood Advisory Committee. And so that was leaders from, all the different neighborhoods right here around Kew Gardens that really got to participate. And those meetings were really extensive. There were sometimes the meetings would last 4+ hours just in those NAC meetings alone. And throughout that period, unfortunately, I got to hear a lot of NIMBYism. They talked a lot about, and Andrew Yang had mentioned in the interview around the height of buildings. And in Queens specifically, there was a lot of community members that had voiced their concern that the height of the building was going to be 25 stories. But if you actually are at the Queens Detention Center, which still holds people during the day to go to court, so it's closed to hold people overnight, but there's still people who are incarcerated that are going to court dates that are being held in the Queens Detention Center. If you look directly across the street, there's a 25-story apartment building right there. So, trying to say that the 25 stories didn't match the landscape of the neighborhood was just a false statement, right? I mean, you could literally look out the door and see a 25-story building right there. And I heard a lot of community leaders, right, that would report things like addiction was a choice and that mental health is a choice. So there was a lot of misinformation from a lot of community members in a lot of community board meetings that I attended. And it was, the commission and us advocates really pushing back, really dropping off, gobs of paperwork, reports, research, and really kind of trying to educate them. When the Queens community specifically, said that bringing a detention center in the community, which there's already one there, would increase crime rates and decrease property values, we worked with the Lippman Commission, and they did research, and they issued reports that indicated that that's not true, that there's communities here in New York already, the Tombs, for example, is one, but also all across the United States, not increase crime, nor do they decrease property value, right? So there was extensive community engagement where, we really had to take the principles and facts back to the community and continue to re-educate them. And that's something that I would love to see the next administration, play an even stronger role in, really holding the community and society as a whole accountable to really getting the facts out there and not listening to NIMBYism that's so very clearly, tied to racism and hatred. So, overall, I would say that we had a very, very extensive community process, and we continue to do community meetings around this, specifically with the design. So it has not ended. And I know that the NAC for Queens specifically, had stopped for a few months, but I know that they're supposed to start up again. So, we continue to educate the community about this on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thanks. To follow up with that, I want to bring Reverend Wendy back. The only site during the Euler process, the only site that did not currently have a borough jail was the Bronx location. And the Bronx is also home to the Vernon C. Bain Correctional Facility, AKA the boat, a literal floating ship that people are incarcerated on. So Reverend Wendy, how have you discussed, or come across conversations in your community around the borough-based jail plan? And, how did folks make the decision to testify or participate in the process?
Well, I think a lot of people that were personally impacted by it. So parents who had to take, a train and a bus and a walk to get over to the boat testified about wanting something that was closer to the community, more accessible. And also people who were on the boat. The boat is uncomfortable, and it's a barge. I think at one of our meetings we termed it the slave ship. So people who were personally impacted, people in the community. And what I found was that the divide in the community was some very, very vocal people who believed that the land was theirs by some promise, and thus for that reason they had a right. I was at a meeting where I heard them say, "You see those people," and I was like, I was very offended, because those people who testified were people who worked tirelessly to change their community, and perhaps at one point they made mistakes, but we've all made mistakes, and they were doing great things right now, but they were those people like animals. And I was so offended. As a minister, I was offended. And I said to someone, I was like, you're a Christian. You're supposed to have compassion on people. And she said, yes, but not in my neighborhood. And I thought, that's not what Jesus said. What would Jesus do? He would have compassion and he would bring people close. And so I think the other thing is, I realized that the news and the with all due respect to the newspapers who are watching us, the people, who curse the most, the people who scream the most, they got the attention. But, those who were calm and quiet and had a loved one in Rikers and wanted the person nearby and didn't want to lose a job to visit their child in Rikers and didn't want it to be a 6-hour trip, those people, they weren't cursing, so they weren't getting news attention, with all due respect. So I feel like I remember I went to the very first public town hall on it, and I brought my kids, and I was so proud of my young people who had done so much strides to change their future. And the lies and the just the wickedness, I made my kids go home. I told my staff, take them home, because we tell them who they are and who they will be, right? We tell them that their bad mistakes will not affect them for the rest of their life. It will be a mistake that is in the past, like everyone has made mistakes. And then I walked into a room of people who were Black and brown. It was just bad. It was bad. It was a bad situation. So I will say, I do believe there needs to be community there needs to be community conversation. There needs to be information, but the Bronx had a really wonderfully functioning neighborhood advisory committee. We'd eat dinner. People were like, you're the only borough that eats. I said, yo soy colombiana. If you're going to come to my house, I will feed you. Especially, everybody was volunteering their time. I was like, how do you volunteer your time from 6 to 8 and not eat? No, we will. And I would pack food. You got kids here, take a chicken home for your kids. So, that's who we are in the Bronx. So the best would have been to not have converted the jail on 161st like 20 years ago when we converted it to something else. That would have been the best. But we can't go back 20 years. We can't take that grocery store away now. You know what I'm saying? So we're doing the best we can, and we're for those who wanted that space to be housing, there's housing. They're going to get housing. We negotiated that. We didn't say, well, you cursed us out. So, I didn't say it. So we're not, no, we said, okay, how do we create the housing? And there were some very good points. Some people said, we need bigger bedrooms. And I went and complained and said, we need bigger bedrooms. We need more housing. We need more diversity. So I do believe that the Bronx NAC process was long and it was difficult and it was exhausting. But I think, there were a lot of people in the Bronx who want to be near their family members. Let's just be clear. And then even lawyers, people get upset about public defenders. I was like, how do you expect them to see their clients if it takes 7 hours to get in and out of Rikers? And they weren't seeing their clients because it was impossible. So, let's bring them near. So I'm excited. I feel like we're going forward. We cannot go back. And I think it's important to hold future candidates. We are going to go forward on this because Rikers is a stain. And definitely. We're going to redeem the earth of Rikers. I'm going to go pray over Rikers when we finally close it down.
Thank you, Reverend Wendy. And our next question, before we go to the Diane Morales video, I want to ask Sharon to join me again. We have heard from a lot of candidates through the questionnaire and through both of these video interviews that they're eager to address the demands of closing Rosie's as quickly as possible and getting women and transgender nonconforming folks off of the island as quick as possible. Can you tell us a little bit about who are the women and the trans and gender nonconforming folks on Rikers, and what questions do we need to be asking to make sure that this moves forward?
Well, thank you, Brandon. Well, what do we know, right? WCJ knows that there's 5,698 people on Rikers Island right now. 277 of them are women. 219 of the women are pre-trial. 15 of them are on tech violation. 23 of them have an open case and a violation. 10 of them a city sentence and 10 are state ready, right? And out of that, 60% of the pre-trial, which is 80%, right, of the 277, only 5 number of women are there for sex trafficking. So I'm a little unclear, right, on what has been said. And out of the 277 women, 174 of them are from the Black and the brown community, right? Which means what they're actually saying is that the plantation still needs to the cotton still needs to be picked from the plantation. At the end of the day, what needs to be asked is, what are the actionable steps that will be taken, right, to ensure that not just Rikers Island are closed, because as you see by the numbers, out of all of the people on Rikers Island, only less than 300 of them are in the women's facility, right? That can be closed right now. And I just feel like, people are saying a lot of things, right? But the important thing is, what steps are going to be taken when you step into this mayorship, right, to ensure that Rikers Island, that this plan moves forward. So it's about accountability. How as the mayor, hold yourself accountable, right, to these things that you are saying, because these are the things that has been missing from all of this time. People say a lot of things. They'll piss on you and tell you it's raining, right? But it's not raining. It's piss, right? And so we really just want to know, right, what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And how long will it take you to get there? Those are the questions that we want to know. And I think that it's important that we hold any one of them, right, whoever our next mayor is going to be, accountable and hold them to the fire. We're tired of hearing the talk. It sounds good, but what is the actionable steps that we need to take them to hold them to task? Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And now we're going to jump right into our next one-to-one interview, which was between Kendra and Diane Morales.
Of the more difficult challenges that we experience, right, when we're looking to decarcerate is some of the folks who have a mental health issue, but their charge might have been a very violent charge. So how would you support decarcerating those folks? Like, what are some tools that you would use or invest in?
Yeah, so, I was the first candidate to call for defunding the police. I've called for defunding by $3 billion. And part of what I talk about when I talk about that is divesting and reinvesting, right? We've got to recognize right now we have a sort of one size fits all response to everything that happens in our city, right? Whether it's somebody who's having a mental health crisis or somebody who's struggling with homelessness or somebody who's stabbed someone else. Our responses are all the same. It's call the police. Our responses should be tailored and specific to the crisis at hand, so that we're providing as much help and support to the person in crisis as possible. So I've called for the creation of a community first responders department as part of this, because we know that a significant part of the number of the calls that the police are responding to are not crimes in progress. And the other thing I like to think that pops into my head whenever I say this is police don't actually prevent crime. They respond to whatever these calls are. And so the Community First Responders Department would actually be people who are trained and skilled at intervention and de-escalation, not just on their own, but who are also part of a larger ecosystem of services like mental health providers, housing providers, medical care, so that once they actually sort of, intervene in the immediate crisis, they're actually connecting that person to something else, right? So that we can move towards breaking the cycle. Because right now what happens is the police respond, and if we're lucky, that person gets locked up overnight and released the next day. That's the best case scenario, and it still causes harm. The worst case scenario, that person is physically harmed or killed. And we actually need to respond in a way that prioritizes the well-being and the safety of the person who's in crisis, and have responses that are appropriate to the issue at hand. So that is one of the things that I have called for in terms of the beginnings of an alternative to the way we're addressing things now.
All right. And going along with that as well, the judicial system, you hit on it a little bit. For our folks that have more serious charges, it's much harder for us to advocate and get them released into alternative to incarceration programs. Is that something that you would make a priority as mayor?
Yeah, I think we need to focus on, rather than the criminal legal system that we have, we need to focus on transformative justice and really providing people with the supports that they need to address whatever egregious, grievance or egregious behavior they've engaged in, so that we can help them kind of reintegrate into the community and really give them a pathway to being able to be as productive and constructive and as integrated as possible. I'm a believer that no one aspires to do harm in that way, and that these things are symptoms of other issues that have not been addressed, and that we really need to prioritize finding ways to help people heal, and help people overcome the multiple traumas that that our multiple systems impact on people's lives, rather than this sort of punitive thing that does nothing to transform the conditions of that individual's lives, and in fact, I think imposes and inflicts more harm.
Have you done any projections on how low you believe the jail population could be by 2027?
Quite frankly, we are, one of the things I talk about all the time is like, I'm not the hero and I'm not the savior. I'm not projecting myself to be like, the one with all the answers. What I am doing is relying on folks on the ground who've been doing this work and who are the experts to help inform the agenda for City Hall, right? Because the people that are closest to the problems are also closest to the solutions. And so I am not inventing my own things in a silo separate from the folks on the ground who've been doing the advocacy and the activism. I am actually more than willing to adopt and amplify the messages of the community in terms of what people think we need to do. The only thing for me that's non-negotiable is my values. And my values are essentially aligned with the idea that everyone has value and that everyone has the right to live in, with dignity, care, and solidarity. And those are the three sort of pillars of the platform. So for us right now in the campaign, while this is obviously part of what we refer to as a co-creation, we talk about co-creating strategy and policy with people on the ground. Right now, we are, very much in alignment with the Close Rikers movement, August 31st, 2027, reducing the jail capacity to 3,300, and sort of willing to kind of follow the lead that you all are taking in this fight.
Do you support moving forward with the Renewable Rikers plan?
Yeah, I do actually support that plan. I feel like we need to fight both mass incarceration and the climate crisis, and this gives us an opportunity to kind of get a twofer, right? Get people out of the awful conditions of Rikers and actually repurpose that facility so that we're actually doing some good for New Yorkers. So I think that's a good idea.
And in supporting it, how would you ensure the transfer of land from DOC to the Department of Citywide Administrative Services as quickly as possible as jails are emptied?
How would I support the transfer of land? I mean, the sort of quick and dirty answer to that is, as mayor, you get to sort of expedite that and make sure that that's happening, and make sure that it's happening in a fair and just way, and in a timely way. I think that one of the things that I think about that comes up a lot with sort of the idea of, my positions and taking on the criminal legal system and the entrenched unions and the entrenched, workers' interests and all of that stuff is I get to be a little bit unapologetic and unabashed because my loyalty is to the people and the folks that have made my campaign possible, my candidacy possible, and would make my administration possible. But the other thing is I have a lot of experience as an executive, as someone who's actually been responsible for like getting ish done. And, I sort of know how to do that. I know how to actually even navigate situations where there are opponents or people that are opposed to what it is that you're trying to do, and to just get it done, while bringing along as many people as you can bring along, but also recognizing that you're never going to get 100% agreement, and you've got to figure out how to navigate those people too.
Are you committed to closing the Rose M. Singer Center before 2027, since there's only 275 women?
Yeah, I mean, I think that seems to me like what we would consider low-hanging fruit, right? I also know, I mean, this is going to be biased, but women are caretakers, women are problem solvers, women are multitaskers, women are leaders, women are community pillars. We need to support getting these women back to their community and providing them with the help that they need and the resources that they need to re-enter into their communities in a stable, as safe, and as secure a way as possible, so that they can begin their own healing journey, and do what women do, which is just be powerful pillars and contributors to the community and to society, and prioritize them, because we need to just move towards valuing and respecting women for everything that we are and everything that we do.
You know, and I'm really happy you said that the prioritizing, I think, is, you know, the most important, right? And we always talk about it, so you're not biased, because when you incarcerate a woman, you incarcerate the family, you incarcerate the community. That's usually the one that's taking care of the kids. They're holding down the men in their lives. Right? As an incarcerated woman, you see that we don't have a lot of people that come visit us, because it's always us visiting the men who are inside, right? And it's the grandma taking care of the kids, and so it's definitely important. You know, we always talk about that. I don't think that that's a bias at all. And the Department of Corrections, for example, employs 8 times more officers per incarcerated person than the national average. So would you reduce the Department of Corrections annual budget? And if yes, by how much and over what period of time?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So yes, we would absolutely move to reduce the DOC's budget. I mean, you know, they've been under federal monitor for years, and they just keep getting worse. And I think if I'm recalling correctly, it's something like, you know, we're spending $1.32 on incarceration versus like $1 on housing in the city. So it just speaks to like how skewed our priorities are. And so we're just actually, to be honest, getting into an analysis of the corrections budget to try to get to the figure that we're going to divest. That's the word that we use, divest. And by when, because we're looking to really prioritize investing in things, and education, and economic security for folks, and moving away from the carceral system. So that we also want to make sure actually that we do that in such a way that provides options for a just transition for some of the DOC workers, because I know that a lot of them are women of color. But we also need to find ways to expand the accountability mechanisms, because DOC officers also need to be held accountable. That we need to make sure that there's transparency around their behaviors and an accountability process. So stay tuned on those numbers, because we're doing that deep dive right now. We're finding all kinds of criminal legal money all over the city in all kinds of city agencies, not just those that are explicitly part of the system.
Have you ever been detained on Rikers, or have you ever visited a loved one who is detained on Rikers?
I haven't. I haven't been on Rikers. I did work closely with, when I was at the Department of Education, with the academy folks, but no, I haven't been there. I will be there though. I will be there as mayor. That would be something that I would do on a regular basis, particularly as we move towards the closure, to make sure that folks are being taken care of as much as they're incarcerated.
Thank you. I want to bring Darren back up, and thank you, Kendra, for that interview. For our viewers, I want to share that in October 2019, the New York City Council actually passed a bill that defines minimum standards in New York City jails. Currently, 0 of the 14 existing detention facilities in New York City meet these minimum standards. And I want to check in with Darren. You were on Rikers Island, and you've been in the Brooklyn House. You were on Rikers when the population was over 20,000 people. New York City only has approximately 15,000 jail beds, and that includes the Manhattan Tombs and the Brooklyn House. But you were on Rikers when it had over 20,000 people. Can you talk a little bit about the conditions you experienced at Rikers in the Brooklyn House, which people are still facing today?
Yes. If people think Rikers is bad now, it was even worse back then. The dehumanization and brutalization by DOC staff was a daily occurrence. And I think it's because, desensitizing COs is part of the program. Like, It's part of the training, like the military desensitizes soldiers going to fight a war. And you can hear it in their tone when they're using dehumanizing language to refer to incarcerated people as inmates. You can hear it. And that's just part of it. In regards to the Brooklyn Detention Complex, like also known as the Brooklyn House, people might not know that it's the oldest facility in the borough, built in 1957. And the cells there were so small that you could just like extend your hands and touch both of the walls on each side. And like you said, it does not meet minimum standards, but our city's thirst for punishment and incarceration detain people in these conditions anyway. In 2018, incarcerated people organized one of the largest strikes in the history of this country, known as the National Prison Strike, and which had 10 demands. And the number one demand was immediate improvements to the conditions of prisons and prison policies that recognize the humanity of imprisoned men and women. And for formerly incarcerated people, and especially currently incarcerated people, as long as anyone is detained, conditions matter.
Yeah, that's the best way to put it. As long as anyone is inside, conditions matter. And Kendra and Diane Morales also touched on, you just touched on it too, but DOC accountability. So Ms. V, I want to bring you back as someone who has worked on both sides of the bars. What can you say about how the jails are operated, and how I think over the years, you've talked a lot as a mental health advocate, talked a lot about how DOC is the city's #1 mental health service provider, right? It is alarming that a law enforcement agency is our #1 mental health service provider. So can you talk a little bit about that and some of the work that you've been doing to shed light on that?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I think it's really important for, the first candidate that you played the interview, he mentioned mental health quite often. And so I think it's important that the city knows in New York City, 52 to 53%, it fluctuates, behind the wall and currently incarcerated have a mental health concern. So my question is to the mayor or the mayor candidates, what are you going to do about diversion? Because diversion is a must, right? And so when we put people who already have a mental health diagnosis behind the correctional walls with staff who are not trained to deal with mental health, you see escalations, you see fights breaking out, you see barbaric behavior, and you see people placed in solitary confinement for reasons of decompensating, for lack of adequate and appropriate medical care. I want to point out really quick that we also need to start holding our judges accountable, right? Because judges, ignorance is not an excuse. And, even for those people that scream, don't build borough jails, I would tell them, make sure you shut down the courts first. Because even during this pandemic, we've had several people die behind the wall while there for a parole violation, a technical violation. They shouldn't have been there. They should have been diverted. They should have never been placed in the pandemic where you sleep 2 feet apart from someone that you don't know, right? When we're outside and we're being told wear a mask and stay 6 feet apart. Also, I want to highlight the young adults. In 2014, the Jails Action Coalition was very successful, along with the council member Drum, to end solitary confinement for 16 to 24-year-olds. However, in 2015, the Department of Corrections opened up ESH, Enhanced Supervision Housing, right? Solitary by another name. It is time for us to make sure that the young adults whose brains cognitively aren't even fully developing until 24, 25 are not on the island. They have to be removed. Sharon said the women could be removed immediately. So can the young adults. Their mental health is our responsibility. Their accountability is across the board. It's on us to educate, and it's on us to make sure that these things are enforced, because trauma is real, right? And re-entry really begins behind the wall. And so we always tell people we want you to be better. Society says if we put you in jail, if we put you in prison, you should come out and do better. But what are we doing as society to make sure that when they come out, they can do better? They can be independent. They can be successful. They aren't cycled through systems that will put them right back into the criminal legal system. That's our responsibility. Mental health, even if you didn't have a diagnosis when you went into the correctional system, I believe of over 10, almost 15, 16 years of working behind walls, that everyone who walks out of a correctional facility has a diagnosis now because of the trauma they went through while inside. So accountability across the board is a must. It's absolutely a must.
Wow, thank you very much, Ms. V. That was powerful. And I want to thank all of our panelists before we go into this Q&A now. So thank you each. We are going to take some questions from both the chat on Facebook and YouTube, and also we're going to air some questions from survivors of Rikers Island that are directed at mayoral candidates, right? As we were preparing for this forum, I talked about this a little bit at the top of the program. In preparing for this forum, the goal was to have these candidates be here and be accountable to their constituents, be accountable to those most impacted by the systems of oppression that they're talking about on the campaign trail. But due to their schedules or priorities, candidates were not able to participate live. So we still want to give a voice to the people, the impacted survivors of Rikers who have led this work and will continue to lead this advocacy before this new mayor is elected and long after this new mayor has their first or second term. So our first video question will come from Eileen Mayer, a member of WCJA and the Justice for Women's Task Force.
I'm Eileen, and I am formerly incarcerated. I spent 420 days on Rikers Island at the Rose M. Singer Center. I have been working on the Close Rosie's campaign in conjunction with closing Rikers entirely. There are only 274 women at Rikers now. They could be transferred to another facility, a better facility off of the island, possibly the old Bayview building. This would be a catalyst in expediting the entire closing. We need a mayor who is willing to continue this work and get Torture Island permanently closed faster than August 2027.
Thank you. And remember, folks, you can just type your questions into the chat. And if there were questions asked early in the program, we'll try to scroll up and catch some of those. I want to call up our next question coming from Marco Barrios, who is a campaign leader at Freedom Agenda.
My name is Marco Barrios. I'm formerly incarcerated and a disabled veteran. I want to know what the next mayor will do to protect people with mental health needs. My question to you is, what dollar amount will you invest to expand existing supportive housing models for people living with serious mental illness? And can you name service providers whose work you believe in and support? Thank you.
And I am viewing the chat. Just want to share a comment that has come in since we started the Q&A. That from Bob Mara, can someone click that and share that on the screen? That every candidate and general public, adults and youth, should visit Rikers Island and other jails. And this is true. I did see a comment in the chat before saying that borough-based jails normalizes incarceration and systems of punishment. And I deeply believe that keeping 400 acres of land that is only used for 9 detention facilities is really what normalizes incarceration and systems of punishment. And that by bringing facilities closer to communities, closer to courts, and shrinking citywide jail capacity, we're able to fight those systems of oppression and make sure that we are divesting from law enforcement, divesting from those systems in the process. But as long as New York City retains capacity to cage 15,000 New Yorkers, then we've already normalized these systems. And our next video question will come from Megan P. with the Beyond Rosie's campaign.
All of us in New York City who are impacted by the criminal justice system are excited that Rikers will be closing. However, we understand that this is not going to happen for some years. What we want to know is what, if anything, you plan to do about pretrial detention and the amount of time that people are sitting on Rikers waiting for an outcome of their case.
Thank you. And we'll play one more video question before we go to a question from the chat from Anna.
My name is Anna. I have lived in Lower Manhattan for over 30 years, and my son was incarcerated on Rikers Island for 6 years while waiting for trial. We have worked so hard to secure the closure of Rikers Island and force the current mayor to adopt a real plan to demolish the jails. I have reached out to mayoral candidates asking to meet with them and others like me who have made closing Rikers Island a reality. New York City has 14 jails today. I believe that it's a huge problem. Stop telling us that the borough jails are too large or a disaster plan. Please tell us how you will make them smaller and better. What is your plan to get people out of Rikers and the boat now? What will you do to reduce the numbers of jails and jail beds? Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to a question from Nathan Yaffe, or Yaff, apologies, in the chat for Miss V. We'll have Miss V respond to this. So the hosts have acknowledged that City Council passed minimum standards for jails in 2019. Still, 0 out of 14 New York City jails meet them, and DOC has been under a federal monitor for a decade and is getting worse. What do we think, what do those who want to build new jails think will be different? Ms. V?
Brandon, thank you so much for giving me this question. First, I want to point out that it hasn't been a decade. It's been about 5 years that they've been under federal monitors, and we are fighting for change. We are fighting to hold people accountable. The other part of that question, I just think what borough jails, here's the thing. I don't want to build any new jails in New York City, especially from the barbaric tortures and violations of human rights I've witnessed behind the wall. However, as I quickly stated before, society has a duty on the outside to make sure that people are afforded their human rights. And you cannot do that when someone is cast off on an island that you can't even get to without proper credentials. Then if you have the proper credentials, you could be stopped at any time because it's an officer's world. And I just want to say something. A couple of years ago, there was a big uproar in Brooklyn around a federal jail. And the reason the uproar occurred is because we could go outside and see there are no lights on. We could hear the individuals incarcerated banging on the walls, calling for help. And that caused an uproar throughout the city. If you don't believe me, Google it. And I truly believe that uproar came because we had access to our community members. Let's not forget, people incarcerated in Rikers Island or on the boat, 85% are waiting their day in court. They still belong to our communities. It is our responsibility. It is our duty to make sure that they are taken care of, that they are afforded everything. And you cannot do that on an island, but you can do it on a borough facility. And if people still have to be incarcerated because of community supervision, because of all the things that connect you to the criminal legal system, right? Well, let's not forget probation, and all these things that can lead you back into being in jail. If the courts are still open to violate people and remand people, then it's our duty. It is our duty to make sure that any place that they're being placed against their will while they're waiting for their fair day in court is upheld to minimum standards and protocols are being followed, and you do not have access on the island. Bottom line.
Thank you, Ms. V. Appreciate that. Yeah, I think you invoked something that Darren had said before too. As long as anyone is incarcerated or detained, the conditions matter. And if the conditions are buildings that were constructed 90 some odd years ago versus facilities that could be built and constructed today, that is a decision that impacted communities have fought for.
Brandon, can I just say one thing real quick?
Go ahead.
The island is falling apart so bad. I have people calling me, and I have recordings of this, of out of 5 bathrooms, 3 working. People have fallen in the shower because the floor is crumbling. And DLC does nothing to fix this, but people are still housed in these areas. So not only are you now hit with a charge, you are now coming out of DLC disabled, limited mobility because of injuries that you have occurred because of the crumbling environment. And not forget the fumes and everything else that causes cancer. That's a whole nother story to get on. So yes, we have a duty to protect our community. Bottom line.
Thank you, Ms. V. And before I pass it over to Susan Shah of Trinity Wall Street Church, I want to respond to, I see Zach Martin, pastor from Trellis, in the chat. How can we work to ensure that restorative justice / transformational justice practices form the foundation for new facilities? And I think that comes down, our conversation has always come down to that just transition. How do we divest from punitive law enforcement roles and punitive agencies overseeing the daily operations of these facilities and investing in our care economy in the same way that we see investments in law enforcement? The NYPD has $6 billion to play with every year in our budget. The Department of Corrections is about to have over $2 billion to play with every year in their budget. How do we take that $8 billion and cut it in half and then double down on that investment for social workers and case managers so that restorative justice and transformational justice are the root of what's happening in facilities when people are detained against their will? Thank you all very much for your questions and for participating. We will send a bunch of issue briefs, all of the responses from candidates and the full 30-minute interviews with Diane Morales and Andrew Yang for folks to interact with towards tomorrow and the end of the week. But I want to pass to Susan Shah from Trinity Wall Street Church to close us out. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Brandon. And thank you to all the mayoral candidates who participated in this important conversation about what many of us say is the biggest racial justice issue facing our next administration. Anyone running for New York City mayor must commit to permanently closing Rikers Island on the fastest timeline possible and be accountable to the communities that are most harmed by the jail system. This is not something that we can be silent about. Silence is not an option. Silence means Rikers does not close and the brutality continues. So on behalf of Trinity Church Wall Street, I want to thank all of the advocates, many of whom are survivors of Rikers, for their tireless commitment to closing Rikers. The organizations that brought this program to you, Freedom Agenda, Legal Action Center, Women's Community Justice Association, BronxConnect, New York City Jails Action Coalition, and the Vera Institute of Justice are all critical to this fight. As a faith-based institution, we at Trinity understand that decarceration is a moral imperative, and we can make this happen as we are ending Riker Jail's brutal treatment of poor and underserved New Yorkers of color. As New Yorkers, we must care about this, and we must hold our city leaders accountable to ending this. So the future of racial justice in our beloved city is in our hands. Let's move forward. Take what you heard tonight to the polls with you next month in November, and then in 2022 when our next mayor assumes office. Thank you very much. Have a good evening and be well.